Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our second webinar series on prioritized zoonosis in Somalia 2023. The objective of this webinar is to enlighten the importance and increase awareness regarding zoonotic disease among different stakeholders. Today, we will discuss social, economics, and environmental drivers of zoonotic disease. We will hear from Prof. Dr. Joacim, Rockloev, and Dr. Marina. To introduce them, Prof. Joacim is an epidemiologist, modeler, and a data scientist conducting interdisciplinary research within the field of climate change and infectious disease. He obtained his PhD from Umeå University in Sweden. In the year of 2021, he was awarded as Alexander von Humboldt Professorship endowed by the Federal Ministry of Education and Research in Germany. The chair at Heidelberg University focused on applying data science and modeling to the area of One Health and climate change. It functioned as a bridge between the Heidelberg Institute of Global Health and the Interdisciplinary Center for Scientific Computing at Heidelberg University. In 2018, Joacim was awarded the Albert II of Monacan and the Institute of Besture Prize for research on environmental change and infectious disease. Prof. Rockloev is the principal investigator and co-principal investigator of several major research projects within the area of climate change and infectious disease and pandemic preparedness. He is a guest professor at Umeå University in Sweden. And our second presenter will be Dr. Marina Treskova. Marina is a postdoctorate scientist. She has completed her PhD in health economics, where she focused on the model-based evaluation of public health intervention, such as vaccination and cancer screening. She has also been trained in biology and epidemiology. Her current research interest and focus lay on the impact of changed climate on infectious disease such as vector-borne and zoonotic disease. She is particularly interested in investigating climate change and land use effect of zoonotic diseases, and of zoonotic pathogen spillover from reservoir host animals to human and domestic animal. Further, her domain includes interventions that go beyond conventional public health and target disease emergence at the source. These include upstream prevention policy, mosquito bite control, and nature-based solution. In her research, she utilized different model and method of intervention science to explore effective and cost-effective ways to prevent the emergence and re-emergence of infectious disease. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any question during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your UA box. I will bring them during the presentation, and we will also have time for question at the end. Without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Marina to the stage.
Hello. Thank you so much, Amir. I hope you pronounce your name quite correctly. Thank you for a kind introduction, and many thanks for the invitation to participate in your webinar. Ahmed, very nice to receive these invitations. I have to apologize right away on behalf of Joacim Rockloev. He is a little bit, there was an overlap in another meeting of his, and he will join us in 10-20 minutes, and he will also give the presentation. I hope you can hear me well, and I would like to just a little bit more introduce our team here in Heidelberg and what Joacim is leading, and just to take some of your time and talk about my team, our team, and then I will jump on the presentation just to give a background and of our expertise, why we actually able to talk about this topic with you today. So this is our website, and Joacim just started this team in Heidelberg. He moved from Umeå, from Sweden, as you were told, and this is him and is our team, just part of it, and we are building it up, and there are multiple disciplines within our team, heavily driven by mathematics, computer scientists, epidemiology, but we also have, of course, social scientists, political scientists, veterinary scientists on board. So we can involve into transdisciplinary research. We call ourselves like climate sensitive infectious disease lab and focus on infectious diseases, zoonotic diseases, and vector-borne diseases. So we look on infectious diseases from the ecological point of view and the dynamics and macroecological patterns of different infectious diseases and ecological and social factors that might influence on the system that surrounds the infectious diseases, such as zoonosis and vector-borne. We also study the pandemic regions, basically the process of spillover, that I will be talking about today, and in particular the interest of my research, and where we look into the interactions between animal and people and the environmental interface, and how it can lead to the cross-species viral transmission, and particularly to the pandemic origin, such as we observed in COVID-19. And we utilize for that multiple methods, including, of course, the modeling methods, data science methods, but also we work closely together with communities in Thailand, Laos, and, for example, in Philippines, trying to collect data, primary data, already hypothesis-driven collection of the data, and trying to advance the science on pandemic origin within the hotspots of such interactions. What we also, of course, doing is we're trying to use capacity. I'm not so sure what I'm doing here. Do you see that? I'm not so sure who is drawing here something bad. Okay. Yeah, so we use predictive capacity. So we use the models to utilize the data and establish predictive modeling to increase predictive capacity, meaning based on the macroecological patterns that we define using modeling, we could predict exposure and infectious diseases risks and so on. And we try to utilize it and inform decision makers about this increasing of the risk. For example, Professor Rockloev or Joacim, he is one of the contributors and leaders of the Lancet Countdown, which actually the journal tailored to decision makers, which represents multiple indicators of how climate change influence health. And those indicators are model-based, data-based, and updated yearly, and basically can communicate on the predictions of the risk change within multiple domains. We try to utilize novel data streams for infectious disease intelligence, such as, for example, citizen science app, for example, for mosquitoes presence in different areas of, for example, in Barcelona or in cities of Europe, such as Greece, Attica, and so on and so forth. And using spatial temporal modeling and combining the data sources, one can predict the, use the data to predict, again, the infectious diseases risk. I'm sorry, I have like sort of a glitch.
Yeah, please, you can remove, because he's making some trouble, you can remove him, okay? Easy.
Okay.
Just not to interrupt anyone.
Okay, thank you. And I apologize, but I don't really know, haven't had this before. And the last point is in our team is interventions, also in my domain, where we'll look into the interventions of different kinds, but we're focusing on an upstream intervention, meaning that is the intervention that go beyond conventional sense, such as public health, we look into interventions, as you said, nature-based solutions or policy-relevant interventions that would prevent pandemics or prevent vector-borne diseases or infectious diseases a little bit further downstream, as opposed to, you know, outbreak containment, sorry, and for example, like mask wearing. But we look into the also interventions such as ecological restoration, nature-based solution, and trying to connect them to the public health outcomes, including infectious diseases and other unintended consequences, using methods of epidemiology, geographical information systems, and modeling, and trying to develop further scenario-based models that would inform decision makers better and facilitate decision making in terms of they would see, for example, what would be with the risk if something that and that done, if something changes. And for that, we of course apply possible data and modeling and also data collection. That is our team. Of course, you could visit us on the website and yeah, connect with us on possible projects. So I will just start with the presentation. And I just see the Joacim that entered the room. I will give him a word to say hello.
Hello, nice to see everyone. I'm Joacim Rockloev. I'm a professor at Somalia University, working on the One Health research area, focusing mainly on environmental drivers of emergence, transmission, and spillover. And I'm sure Marina has introduced me and her. Thank you.
So I will just share the slide, and we'll start the presentation on the social, economic, environmental drivers of zoonotic infectious disease and vector-borne infectious diseases. Right. So I hope you can see my presentation.
Yes, very clear.
Okay, so I will do the full screen mode. Right.
Yes,
okay.
more clear now.
Perfect. So as you know, basically we'll structure our presentation, thinking about it according to our expertise and our work. So we will talk about the zoonotic infectious diseases, ecology a little bit, vector-borne diseases, and environmental driving factors such as climate more in detail, but also we'll talk about other driving factors of the diseases. And we'll also speak about the possible interventions and how we see them in our work. And if I may start, zoonotic infectious diseases, basically, as you know, are defined as all infectious diseases that are caused by pathogens that are transmittable from non-human animal to a human being. They can be of multiple etiologies, including viral diseases, bacterial diseases, fungi and parasites, and of course, the prions also could be looked as zoonotic infectious diseases. What we are looking into mostly is viral infectious diseases. Those actually have a serious potential for pandemic, origin. So why it's important? Somehow I don't have a control of my presentation sometimes. Spillover. So why pandemic are important and why it's a concern, and zoonotic infectious disease should be taken seriously, not only in the global south, but also in the global north. It's because we see the increasing frequency. It's not only because it's possible that a viral or other disease can be transmitted from environment or a non-human animal to a person, but also we observe, because it's been already for years, as long as we exist, but what we observe is increasing frequency and also intensity of such events and outbreaks and pandemics in recent years. So there should be an understanding why it is happening, and the current research suggests multiple factors. Of course, one of them would be increasing population density, ecological disturbance, urbanization, and increasing in mobility, everything that can facilitate not only the cross-species transmission, but also what can facilitate later a more accelerated transmission from human to human. when we look into the pandemic overall, we look into basically a concept of the stages of pandemic that could be, so to say, grouped into the stages called pathogen emergence and evolution happening within the reservoir host population, and evolving evolutionary processes, basically talking about the characteristics of the infectious disease agents. What I'm trying to say that we have a pathogen emergence as the first stage, but then through the pathway that I'll talk about later, and through the process of spillover, basically the crossover, the barrier of the species, viral diseases can come from one species to another, and at the end of the day, they can come to the humans and inducing the local dynamics, such as, for example, if you could see a short outbreak within the human, or if human can be like an already dead host, and yeah, and the outbreak will stop. But the pandemic could occur if we see the global spread of the disease using the vehicles and vectors of human mobility. So I would like to go a little bit and look more in detail on the spillover process, basically defined as a jump over the species barrier from over viral disease or bacterial disease, but viral is mostly when we look into spillover processes. So we have a different type of understanding what spillover is. It can be through, for example, a direct contact between the reservoir host or environment to a recipient host, for example, from a bat to a person, to a human being, or for example, from a bat to a horse. It would be one direct spillover. Another one, if we have an intermediary host or a vector component where, for example, we have arthropods for the indirect transmission or indirect contact between the recipient, so the animal who has this virus, and then the receiving end, a recipient host. And it is important to understand that when we are trying to investigate the dynamics and the pathways to spillover, we have to look at multiple possibilities of how it can occur. And there's some work been done to understand and to conceptualize the pathways to spillover. And even though we see the increase of frequency of pandemics, one need to say that it's quite a rare event to have such a pandemic of such intensity, such as COVID, just because if you imagine how many animals on Earth exist and how many contacts a human being have to animals such as livestock or even bats or even rodents, we do not see an outbreak every year of a new, for example, disease. It's because spillover or pandemic origin only occurs when multiple factors coincide. And this is well represented by Plowright and her team using the cheese diagram, showing basically the layers and the barriers that a pathogen has to go through to trigger the pandemic origin. So what we see here is layers, for example, of the reservoir host and distribution and the density. There is a dynamics there within their ecosystems and the driving factors of those ecosystems.
Ecology of reservoir hosts, because they have not only the dynamics within the populations that's of importance, because we can see the animal population as well as human populations sharing the pathogens through a context, indirect contacts. They also can be ill and then can also have, spread the infection, and they also are subject to immune struggles. For example, they can have increased mortality due to infection and decreased immunity due to shocks, and so on and so forth. But also we need to understand where they are allocated and whether they are close to humans and livestock and can actually transmit the pathogen to other animals that have relevance for people. Then we need also to look into the infectious disease dynamics within the and disease ecology within the reservoir host population. As I said, we can look into infections intensity and pathogen prevalence within the group, because if the pathogen pressure increases within the population, it can be released from the population, for example, through viral shedding, such as excretion of fecal matter or urine, saliva, or through, for example, slaughtering and or meat consumption, and so on and so forth. The next barrier that pathogen should overcome on the way to spillover is its own characteristics. How, when being shed to the environment, whether this pathogen can survive in the environment long enough to be in contact with the recipient host, or whether human can come to here and be exposed to it. So whether there is an opportunity after being shed for a viral agent to enter another host. And it is important that we have also other barriers, and not only we, but other animals against the pathogen, that is our immune response and compatibility between the species, meaning the cellular compatibility, whether our cells have similar receptors that virus can use to enter the cell and hijack the cellular system to replicate, for example. So I just want to say that the cheese diagram very well represents the barriers that are needed to overcome, so to say, by a pathogen. I don't want to humanize a pathogen that is able to think, but if you think statistically in terms of what events should coincide and to spill over to occur, and especially to lead to a pandemic, you would understand that it's not quite a frequent event, but we observe definitely the increase in the frequency. Next slide. Okay. So a recent publication actually looked into the research about the factors that, also using probably this cheese diagram, what are the factors that lead to spillover of zoonotic infectious diseases, and clustering them into the most important ones that are currently being discussed in the literature. And you could see here the clusters of viral adaptation, climate and vectors factors, food and livestock conditions, environmental contact, global movement, socioeconomic factors, land conversion, biodiversity changes, and reservoir host factors. If we shortly talk about each of these, we can understand the complexity of the system and what factors can we investigate and focus on in the research, but also in the policy. If we talk about viral adaptation on its own, it's basically we talk about the characteristics of the infectious agent on its own. So through the different evolutionary process and mechanism, you know that viruses can evolve through mutation processes, but also they have much more opportunities to mutate when they're being exposed to other hosts, right? Not only because of the natural, but if we increase the context between species or between animals, every time when the virus reproduces, it has much more chances to mutate, and some mutation can increase the fitness of the virus, therefore making it more adaptable to other species. And here we can also talk about viral agents being a generalist and specialist. And generalist, usually those viruses can infect a wider host range, but they're usually not very high in virulence. They maintain their basically transmission, as opposed to specialist viruses that would be specialized within the one host population that would maintain this virus. But some selection pressures, for example, decreasing this population can pressure the virus to mutate and enter another host. However, it can induce a high mortality. So the specialist viruses are usually characterized by high virulence. The next one would be climate change and vectors. This is what we wanted to concentrate on later in our talk. As you know, that climate variation can induce factors such as, for example, climate can influence the vector-borne diseases through the changes of habitat suitability and changes the suitability of the life cycle of vectors that are important for the transmission of vector-borne diseases, but also, for example, we know that extreme events can increase also the surge of virus-borne diseases, but also droughts and, for example, extreme temperatures, hot temperatures can decrease the habitat suitability and remove the disease from certain areas. Food and livestock is interesting pathway. It goes through intensive agriculture, where we put the livestock into very, very dense and concentrated areas where, of course, they are experiencing stress. And when they come to the contact, for example, with avian influenza, that can increase the outbreak of the disease. And you have seen it recently in the recent outbreak of H5N1 avian influenza, that it spread quite fast through the bird population and killed off a lot of livestock, poultry, and then it spread to minks, particularly in those confined environments where the animals are quite susceptible due to lower immune system, and they are very confined and increase the spread of the virus diseases. Environmental contact is mostly related to parasites or protozoa, where we increase our contact to the abiotic environment, where we can see the spread of the parasites and or bacterial diseases, such as, for example, Vibrio, and can be exposed to those and uptake them. They also consider zoonotic infectious diseases, but of not pandemic region, so to say. Global movement and trade are highly associated with the spread of zoonotic infectious diseases, facilitating spillover and transmission from human to human or from animal to human. Social economics, a topic a little bit of our discussion today. It's important to understand that, as we talked about in the cheese diagram, that structural barriers also occur. The socioeconomic factors such as displacement of the population, civil unrest, war, hygiene, poor housing, and so on and so forth, bring people to more contact to rodents or to the vectors, or also reduce the immunity within the population, basically creating much more structural pathways where we can acquire zoonotic infectious diseases that already can be transmitted to humans, but also induce spillover. For example, if a person who needs to feed her or his household and has no other option but go to a habitat of bats and hunt the bat and eat the bushmeat, he or she are exposed to the viruses that are carried by this particular bat. Land conversion is also known, basically anthropogenic land conversion is also known to influence and increase the spillover and zoonotic infectious diseases risks through multiple pathways, for example, through the decrease of the habitat for reservoir hosts, basically making them to move out of the natural area closer to humans' dwellings, increasing the contact between the humans and wildlife, or between the livestock and wildlife. And basically, we actually looking into how the land conversion can otherwise influence the population dynamics of reservoir host and their behavior. That's basically, I think that's a major pathway that I wanted to talk about. The biodiversity, meaning, so if we talk about the cross-species transmission, the biodiversity would include how many species are in this particular area could see, and whether the changes of the biodiversity changes the risks for cross-species transmission through a dilution effect, whether, for example, if in certain areas geographically multiple species are present, and the species between whom the viral transmission can easily occur, they're usually, so to say, diluted by other animals present, and the virus has additional barriers to overcome. And the decrease of the biodiversity will increase the risk of spillover. So that's I wanted to say, but we focus in mostly on the climatic drivers and infectious diseases, and I would like to give the word to Joacim to continue on the climate change and viral diseases.
Thanks, Marina. Yes, I'm going to just shortly introduce the environmental drivers of these diseases and talk a little bit about some case studies or examples on how we've studied that, for example. This graphic is basically just showing pathways which has been documented in relating one environmental factor or climate basically to outbreaks and emergence of various infectious disease. So it's a study that was quite recently published in Nature. Shows that there is more than 1,000 pathways in which climate, for example, can influence these diseases. So that's just shows the width of the climate environmental impacts on disease. Speaking more specifically, I do a lot of work on vector-borne diseases, and many of them are sensitive to environment, obviously, and climate variability, because they are transmitted by insects. The insect is ectotherm, and its life cycle depends on the climatic conditions. Its reproduction depends on climatic conditions, and also its behavior to some extent. I wanted to give some examples on the studies that we've been doing on dengue, for example, and chikungunya, where in order to understand and describe the dynamics and how environment and climate is affecting those diseases, we do look at different traits and how those traits depend on environment. And we estimate from studies and experiments and field studies how, for example, the biting rate depends on temperature, how the reproduction of virus, the extrinsic incubation in the mosquito, the tiger mosquito, Aedes albopictus in this case, or Aedes aegypti, how that depends on temperature, for example. So usually when it's colder, the extrinsic incubation period of from the midguts of when the mosquito gets feeds on humans and gets exposed to virus through the midguts, it takes time before it reproduces virus, if ever, to its salivary glands. And this is determined by the extrinsic incubation period. So when it has reproduced virus to the salivary glands, it can transmit the disease further. And that's also a process that's shown to be dependent on temperature and the mosquito's metabolism. There is also the mortality rate and survival of mosquito, which is really important because in some environments, so for example in Europe where I'm now, even if the mosquitoes would be here and they would bite a person that carries virus, it would probably still not be able to survive enough long to reproduce the virus and be able to transmit it to someone else, because the survival is also highly depending on the climate conditions. So you usually find the peak survival around 28 to 30 degrees. And if the variability within the day is very large, it means of temperature, it means that the overall survival goes down. So it's a stable, like 28, 30 degrees would be perfect. Humidity is also obviously important. The biting rate is also shown to be increasing with higher temperature. Higher temperature at some level is also really bad, and both mortality goes up, and so there is basically again no ability of the mosquitoes to reproduce virus. Okay, so for dengue, we, based on experimental and field data, put together these figures that shows how the vectorial capacity of Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus depends on temperature. You see basically peak values around the 30 degrees that I was talking about before, and if you go out to the higher end, the top of these graphics, you see a reduced ability, vectorial capacity, for both mosquitoes, because you have a higher daily variation in temperature. So this would typically be something that you see more in temperate climates, and the more stable conditions with low diurnal temperature range would be typically be something you see more in tropical conditions. If you use this information and these known relationships, and at the same time use climate data, which is available to a much higher degree than mosquito and disease data, one could make predictions on the relative R0 or the absolute predicted R0 as well, and how it changes over time. So that's illustrated here in this graphic. It uses the relationship before a vectorial capacity. It's closely related to R0, and then predicts it out in a gridded fashion across the world over the last 70 years. And you could see quite an upsurge in the trend because overall the climate has become more conducive for the mosquitoes to transmit disease. So we could, in a sense, we could talk about an increase in transmissibility. In some areas, depending on where you are, highlands or cities or areas which are not yet infested or endemic transmission areas, mobility also functions as the vehicle for introduction of virus and transmission, and also for fueling outbreak clusters and probably highly contributing to the hyperendemic situation in many tropical situations. This is just showing a risk assessment that we did for Europe with where we have tiger mosquitoes present and going north. And we looked at the vectorial capacity, how it changes over time, and overlaid mobility from the whole endemic region all over the globe each year, and looked at the mobility into Europe. So we can see basically from this graphic that there is increases in the local suitability of transmission, and there's huge increases in the potential importations of virus from these regions because of mainly human mobility. And when those come together, it facilitates the necessary requirements for outbreaks. When it comes to climate and environmental drivers, one could also use climate data to make projections. So we also can use the same or similar model to look at how potentially abundance of mosquitoes will be affected by climate, and that's shown in this top graph here in 2 different climate scenarios. One that's a high emission, future high concentration, see, there's someone who wants to remotely control my screen.
For a second. We have again a problem, Emir, because
okay, maybe I could just take this down here. I'm not going to accept that. Okay, so you see, like the red graphic here is just a projection. It's not realization. It's based on data and a model, and then we run this into the future based on future modeled climate and assumptions on how much CO2 and carbon we will have in the atmosphere. And you can see that the model predictions show quite different abundance, potential abundance for the mosquitoes globally, this is. And if we look at it in these maps, we also see quite dramatic changes, for example, in large parts of Africa and Asia and the Americas. We also do similar studies on West Nile virus, where we use machine learning, for example, and look at drivers of the emergence of West Nile, which is a factor of mosquitoes, bridge mosquitoes. The bridge mosquitoes that are transmitting in Europe, where we studied, is Culex. We have migrating birds, which are present parts of the year. And the mosquitoes bite the birds who usually, where the virus usually circulates, and then it spills over to animals and humans who are dead-end hosts, and causes outbreaks, which can be quite severe. So in Europe, we had the biggest outbreak so far in 2018, and we wanted to see whether we could predict the spatial extent and the timing of this outbreak using machine learning models. We knew, like dengue, that there is a relationship between temperature and the R-naught of West Nile. So we gathered data for about 10 years. We trained a model up to 2017, so we withheld the 2018 outbreak extent and magnitude from the training, and then we tested to see whether we could predict it, and we could predict it quite well. We had an AOC score which was 0.97, and it dropped a little bit to 0.93 when we tested the 2008 and 2019 data. And that's quite good. I mean, that's the sensitivity and specificity of about 90% or so. The most important drivers were climate and bioclimatic variables. We also had the water index coming up as important. And yeah, so we also had other variables like vectors and birds, but they didn't seem to be as important in predicting the extent. So probably that's it's a necessary requirement for these outbreaks to occur, but it might be in abundance, so it's not a barrier to the outbreak occurring. The same thing for West Nile. If we look at the climate drivers over time, we could predict an upsurging trend in the outbreak risk. So this is really important for monitoring changes in risk and deploying adaptation and control in a strategic and proactive manner.
Yeah, thank you. I will continue talking about viral sharing and spillover and the effects of it, of climate change and land use on viral sharing, basically zoonotic diseases without a vector in between. And I just want to say that we looked into the research efforts in the background of this topic, and we found that climate change was linked highly in the research activities to vector-borne diseases, as already Joacim spoke about vector life cycle. There's some also indication on water and foodborne diseases and the infectious disease in livestock, but spillover pathways and zoonotic infectious diseases are really not really well investigated due to complexity, probably data availability and attribution problems. What would be the theoretical understanding or hypothesis how a climate change and land use can drive zoonotic infectious diseases? It's basically through indirect impact on the ecology and of the reservoir host and their movement ecology. We think about climate change as changing or alteration of biogeophysical factors that influence on the reservoir host population dynamics, including reproduction, mortality, numbers of this numbers and their, for example, spatial aggregation or fusion, and host infection dynamics, basically saying that extreme events can introduce more immunity problems within the population and allow them to shed virus more as opposed to fight the virus. Then we talk about the community ecology and ecosystem functioning. So when we talk about the reservoir host populations, they do not exist alone as they're standing, but they exist within their ecosystem, abiotic and biotic factors, such as, for example, food sources, and the climate change can influence the phenology, meaning the periodicity of life cycle events such as flowering, and this phenology can be disrupted by climate change, and plants can flower and bear fruits earlier as bats, for example, get used to it and they would become hungry. So there is like possibility of phenological discordance here. It also can influence an exposure of humans and livestock to zoonotic pathogen. For example, here would be water security. If the water becomes through climate change quite a scarce resources, you would see the aggregation of different animals around the same water source. Even it's not, for example, not in one time, but animals can shed the viruses into the water, into the environment can be uptaken by livestock of humans later. And also pathogen survival and adaptation, as we spoke about through, for example, increasing the contact between animals, but also creating more suitable environments for persistence, for example, through precipitation. Hendra virus can survive in water, for example, and being picked up by horse later, already much later than bat shed it into the water. So all of this can be investigated and tried to understood. There was recently a paper that looked into the macroecological patterns of influence of climate change through the changes of species distribution across the globe. And they modeled these changes in species distribution through habitat suitability changes, and through climate change induces the mobility of different animals to move towards more suitable environments. And basically what they show that climate change increased the cross-species transmission by 4,000 times by 2070. Year. No? So if we talk a little bit the mechanisms behind this work, is that why do we think that it was connected to climate change? They used species distribution models, as I said, and viral sharing model, and basically showed that the viral crossover has to occur only when there is opportunity and compatibility for this to take place. And opportunity meaning that should be ecological and geographical overlap between the reservoir host driven by climate change. So, for example, if the different animals start to move to shift their ranges because of the climate change and suitability of changes in their habitat, they will enter different territories, inducing an overlap of geographical areas, basically bringing new encounters to a new species and establishing a new contacts, direct or indirect contacts. Anyway, creating an opportunity for this transmission to occur. And another one is a compatibility element. As we spoke about that, the virus has to enter the cell host and hijack the cellular system. For that, we need to be compatible on the receptor sides and immunity side between the animals. So they looked into the mammals and they used phylogenetic compatibility to understand how it is likely that a virus can be transmitted between the pairs of species. Interestingly, that dispersal capacity, because it connected to the movement ecology, was a driving factor. And as you see that they showed Chiroptera, it's basically bats, and Rodentia, because of their dispersal capacity, and they are very highly generalist, but also they're very compatible with the human in terms of their immune system and host cell receptors. They are primary target for the next pandemic inducer. And what they also mentioned that based on their assumptions, mitigation of climate change cannot alone lead to a reduction of pandemic potential decrease. We basically need to increase surveillance. We need to understand the biodiversity and establish some other interventions to avoid the future pandemic based on the ecology of reservoir hosts. Socioeconomic drivers, we want to talk about that. Is your time?
I think we're starting to run a little bit late, so maybe we jump faster and talk a little bit. Maybe, I don't know. I think we should probably stop and wrap up, maybe. We were given 45 to 60 minutes, and now we're at 65.
Amir, you should tell us what to do. Or Ahmed.
Maybe if we wrap up, we could just say that we are, I mean, socioeconomic factors, I talked about mobility as one, but we also work on behavioral studies and knowledge, attitudes, practice surveys to understand behavior and social practice and interactions between humans and animals in a number of the studies that we're running. Marina was showing our webpage, and we have a number of projects where we do field studies to investigate this, and this includes behavioral-oriented interventions. It includes interventions to increase literacy, and it includes transdisciplinary approaches where we work together with stakeholders, community health workers, animal health workers, and policymakers to sort of co-produce these interventions and these tools. I think that's it.
Thank you, Professor, and Dr. Mariana, both of them. Yeah, it was very nice, and it almost touched different aspects. We enjoy all. So you can have more 20 minutes if you have to say something.
I think we're pretty happy. Is there any questions or things that you'd like us to clarify or discuss that we can?
Thank you.
Otherwise,
please, all participants, sorry, you can go ahead, please.
No, otherwise I was just saying that you could always reach out to us afterwards as well if there's something you would want to discuss. We focus quite much on environment and climate drivers of diseases, but in the end, it's a socio-ecological interaction that manifests these type of events and outbreaks and transmission. So that's really at the core of the activities. There's a question from Abdallah.
Yes. Go ahead, Dr. Abdallah, please.
Okay, thank you. Because of time, or of course, thank you for the presenter. Thank you so much. It is not a question, but the part of socioeconomic and behavior is important for us in Africa, please. This topic is very interesting, but I really want to go through the socioeconomic issues and the behavior also, because our behavior in Africa maybe increase the spread of this kind of pathogen. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's super important, and it's also important for the reason that it's easier to change than to change the climate.
Yeah.
And it goes faster, and it's one of the tools that we could work with, I think, in terms of prevention and One Health, prevention and pandemic prevention. So it's super interesting. The socio-ecological, so behavior, ecological interactions that facilitate transmission, I'd say would be key in general, especially for preparedness and prevention, but not only.
I can add to it a little bit, but we're being hijacked again, or hacked again. So the social economic factors, as you know, that they influence on a couple of things, like through behavioral vulnerability, but also social factors such as healthcare system, housing, and one can see that increase in housing and socioeconomic status will definitely reduce for example, the dengue risk. And we also looked into the habitual behavior that increases the risk of zoonotic infectious diseases, meaning the context to the environment and to the animals. And we find that the behaviors on individual level and household level, first of all, are very hard to change, and we are working onto it. And our hypothesis is that it's knowledge deficit based, but it can be also deeply rooted in the culture, in the tradition. So it should be investigated in the local terms. Increasing sanitation, increasing, of course, basically access to the wash, it will remove a certain burden of zoonotic infectious diseases quite quickly, but then incremental improvement will take much more time. And meaning social conditions such as waste management, water management, water quality, sanitation, reduction of the public defecation, or increasing the housing conditions, basically providing people with the governmental support in terms of protection against mosquito-borne diseases, either biological control or chemical control, which we are not actually advocate for, but also surveillance systems, and access to healthcare, but also the knowledge of people to understand the signs of the disease, and to see it as a cue for action and to find and seek healthcare. That is also one of the important factors that decrease the burden. And socioeconomic factors not only mean the household assets, but also the groups of the population that are more vulnerable due to their immune system, such as children and women, children and elderly, but also through occupational hazard. And one can look into those groups as well and make more protective interventions there. I hope I answered your question, Dr. Abdallah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Yes.
Or
Thank
comment.
you.
Yeah, but we agree with you. It's very important with the social aspects.
Thanks a lot.
But in the end, it's an interaction between all these things at the same time. So we need to consider them often at the same time.
Please all feel free to ask if you have any question. You can raise your hand and we will unmute you. Then you can ask. Omar, you can ask.
I would like to clarify key drivers of dengue fever. It is key drivers of dengue fever in emergency. I think that slide are not. It was so. I can't understand that slide. I think to clarify.
I'm not sure I got it totally. Did you get it, Ahmed, or Amir?
Yeah, he's saying like the slide that you discussed about dengue fever. You need some confusion for that. If you can say something for that?
Yeah, so I basically explained how, or tried to explain how environment and climate is influencing different parts of the transmission cycle and the life cycle of vectors. Yeah, and then those parts of the life cycle and transmission cycle that was brought up in the figure was also the same ones that you could use when you look at vectorial capacity or similar to malaria when you look at the entomological inoculation rates and so on. So that was a mathematical framework that we used in combination to these environmental sensitivities. It's basically vectorial capacity where you have temperature dependence of parameters. I don't know if that helps a lot. It can be sometimes a little bit complicated. It depends on how much of infectious disease epidemiology and mathematics have been exposed to.
Yes, thank you, Professor. Please, anyone? You can raise your hand to ask a question. Okay, Dr. Abdallah, go ahead, please.
So I apologize for having two chances, but thank you for giving me another chance, please. But really, I like the topic, you know that, because already it's very, very, very good. So, dear Professor, I want you just to tell me the issue of bear immigration to Europe and in relation to the nice point that I have from your vector survival issues. So how much the prevalence, how much viruses or how many viruses, only West Nile fever virus, for example, or is there any other viruses? And even if the viruses, if the migration is on the time of the temperature rise or temperature, what about the time already of the immigration itself or the migration of the birds from Africa to Europe, for example, from our Indian Ocean here to there in, in your home country. So really this point, I think I want to know if there's any data about the viruses detected from the birds, for example, or if it is just a prediction. I hope my question is a little bit clear. So about the point.
Yeah, so
That point, I like it.
Yeah, no, what we showed was a prediction of outbreaks using bird data. But there's the surveillance of birds, of wild birds, is quite sporadic, and it's not very good in Europe. Otherwise, there would have been a very interesting data source to work on if one could extend the surveillance systems to better include wild birds. I think that's part of your question, so I totally agree there that would be super important. Another part is also the timing of the birds' arrival, because they're migratory birds, which you were also pointing to. There is another sensitivity in climate, obviously, to the seasonal windows of the migration, which usually occurs because of reproduction of food webs, and that hasn't been accounted for. But one would expect both sort of a widening of season and enlarging of geographical regions. And there are some bird migration data available from MoveBank, for example. So you can look at those seasonal migration patterns where you see strong links between the African continent and the European continent, for example. But in terms of the virus circulation among the host, we don't have a good understanding, I think, exactly how it happens, and and the dynamics of the host transmission system. So it's good questions. In that sense, I must say that our study was crude, and there's a lot of improvement that could be made in actually trying to understand the situation, and maybe especially the African continent to the European continent dynamics when it comes to host bird virus circulation and dynamics.
Dr. Ahmed, please. You can go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I think you are hearing me very well, Dr. Amir.
Yes, you can go ahead.
Thank you very much, professors, and thanks for your presentation. As usual, your expertise is of great importance to our community. Thank you very much. With this important topic regarding on environment issue that at least Somali people community are one time flooding and one time drought, and with both socioeconomic and all drivers to the zoonotic diseases, and above all, without the awareness of these zoonotic diseases. Thank you very much, and thanks for your acceptance to do and part with the Somali One Health Center to enhance at least the community awareness. Thank you very much. I just want to ask to get a view about the climate change on zoonotic diseases, that you are doing a modeling of diseases. I just see a lot of years, and in Somalia, for example, we don't have a lot of data. And when it comes to do a modeling, it needs a lot of data to be modelized, and this is not comparable to our country, but still it is good to do such a modeling it at least before 30 years when a lot of work was going here. I think how such things can we do it so as to predict some diseases?
I know that's a very good question, and obviously different regions have different availability of data. Some of the modeling that we've done has focused on Europe because there's good availability of data, but some is not. And depending on which modeling approach you take, you could use parameters from experiments, for example, when it comes to mosquito or animal reproduction, virus levels, etc. And those could be more transferable, I think. Sometimes between regions, it wouldn't necessarily have to be local. So that's one thing that you could, in a sense, you don't necessarily have to measure everything local, but you obviously have to validate the model locally to some data. But validation could be for a shorter period. It could be that you specifically collect data or use surveillance data for a shorter period. It could be 1 or 2 or 3 years, for example, to make sure that your model is actually reproducing and fitting to the local situation, whilst the model might have been developed somewhere else on the base of other data where there's a greater richness. So there's many ways to do that. A lot of the trends I was showed longer term trends because we've built the model for a shorter period, relating and describing the climate dependence of the disease. And climate is highly data that's highly abundant and available, both for longer periods and geographically for a lot of different regions. So climate data you could access in global databases like the Copernicus data or remote sensing data is also available, for example, from NOAA or the NASA satellites, etc., which you then can use if you manage to build a functional prediction model based on those data. Then you could extend and predict the diseases beyond the period where you have collected diseases. If you trust the model, that would be a reliable source of information of potential and likely patterns of disease as well. Yeah, so very good question. Thank you. And thanks for inviting us. It's been very nice. Thank you.
Yeah, we are also happy to have you all. Thank you. I hope we don't have any more questions. All settled. So
Very good.
Again, I apologize all for the inconvenience as you experienced. Terrible difficulties today that we are never predicted, but it's a lesson learned that so we can not to happen for the future. We have to avoid. And thank you for your patience all, and thank you for taking time for us. We are very happy to have you again.
Thank you so much, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.